Well, I want to thank Highland House Museum. I want to thank all of you for coming on this hot night when there are umpteen other meetings. In the year 2000, the Highland House Museum gave Josephine Haber her first solo museum exhibition ever, curated by Elizabeth Colery and Arthur Sanborn. So we're in the right place for a talk about the Habers. I want to thank Anton and Lawrence Schiffenhaus for their gifts of Haber material to PAM and to the Truro Historical Society. Thank Chris McCarthy for her curatorship of the Haber Show last year at PAM, for her lecture here last month, and for permitting me to read Gail Levin's transcripts of Joe Haber's very moving and incendiary diaries, which I'm sure will one day be published in their entirety. I should stress, by the way, these are partial transcripts, and the tone of the whole manuscript may be different. In absentia, I would wish to thank Gail Levin for her exemplary works of scholarship, of which this, is only one of the 4 volumes of the Catalogue Raisonné. She did, together with her doorstopper of a biography, Edward Haber, an intimate biography. And for details about the Habers' lives, really you need to read her book. I'd like to thank Maura Coughlin and Jim Summers for help with PowerPoint, Philip Coach for a photo of the Haber House interior, Geraldine Raymer for locating a coat. Yes, all right. I can actually speak.
Is that better?
Without one of these, but all right. Okay. Okay. I'm not an art historian by training, my academic field being closer to poetry and literary modernism. I'm apologizing in advance for the quality of some slides. They've been pulled off the internet. Some of them are going to be blurry. And I'll be going through the text and slides at a fair clip. So if you have questions during the talk, as well as afterwards, raise your hand and shout, okay? And meanwhile, you may be hearing a groaning sound in the background during my talk. That is my abstract expressionist painter father, George McNeil, rolling over in his grave to hear his daughter paying even a minute's attention to Edward Haber, who for my father's generation of abstract painters in Provincetown in New York totally epitomized what they considered to be a doggedly backward-looking, narrowly nationalist view of painting. So now let's start with the dress. This is the dress. Okay. It is a strange and moving sensation to handle the clothing of the dead. This almost otherworldly experience has happened to many of us as we touch grandmother's yellowed wedding dress or father's old tweed jacket, frayed and patched from years of use. Even that cute 1930s blouse we find at the thrift shop was once worn by the dead. The body of someone now lost inhabited these clothes, filled them out with her body, experienced life in that dress. Briefly and poignantly, we can touch the living being through the intimate material objects of their lives, and at that moment, the person returns to us. This is how fetish operates. The unaltered material object emanates power for good or ill. Touch the dress, see the dress, and you are surrounded by the aura of that person, and the sensation lingers. So it is with Josephine Nimbison Haber's sun-bleached, hand-repaired dress of blue-sprigged cotton, now part of the collection of the Highland House Museum, with other material evidences of Joe's life. When fabric conservator Liz Holbrook was checking Joe's blue dress prior to cleaning it, she was startled to find a clean folded scrap of tracing paper in the long pocket, left there the last time Joe wore it. With this, the blue dress became Joe before our eyes. Then, when Natalie Ferrier and I were arranging Joe's dress on a model for the exhibit in the Haber Room, we were astonished to realize just how petite her body was. We kept trying smaller and smaller models until finally the smallest one worked. In modern dress sizes, Joe was a 4 or 6 petite, about 5'1", or at the most 5'2". So, although many dressmaker dresses in the 1920s and 30s were unlabeled, like Joe's blue dress, Jo appears to have sewn this dress herself. Her mother was a skilled home sewer and alteration seamstress whose imaginative alterations masked the poverty Jo grew up in, and she taught Jo dressmaking techniques. The loose, externally gathered skirt and front bodice opening hark back to Victorian country dressing. Grant Wood uses an only slightly more conservative dress collar to signal his semi-satirical take on American rural life, which, as he said, should be like, quote, tintypes from an old family album. 1930. The badly worn collar, hand-sewn and single cuff in peach-colored cotton and organza that came with the dress are probably not, were probably made by Jo as replacements, since the collar appears lighter in early photos. In this photograph, now identified as from 1927 in the art colony of Ogunquit, Maine, Jo is wearing her blue dress, but it's short-sleeved. However, by the time of the famous 1933 portrait of the Hoppers by Louise Dahl Wolfe, Jo has altered the sleeves to make them long. In other words, she had the fabric to hand. A small treadle Singer sewing machine is mentioned in Levin and in Jo's diaries. Now, why did Jo choose this charming but resolutely unfashionable dress for a portrait commissioned by Frank Crowninshield of Vanity Fair magazine, even if it was not eventually published? Perhaps she chose it to resonate with the Hoppers' American folk art painting, Calvin Howe and His Sisters, which Dahl Wolfe chose for the background. A practice of placing sitters in front of fine art was used often by Dahl Wolfe later in his successful career as a fashion and portrait photographer. And Richard Larkin got me a picture of the original Calvin Howe and His Sisters, at which I realized the picture has been inverted in order to place Jo on the left so that the eye of the viewer moves to the more important figure of Edward on the right. But perhaps it was also a subtle statement by Jo about her own creativity. He, Edward, makes things by hand. I, Jo, make things by hand, even if my paintings are not while we're being photographed. Here's the blue dress again in 1934 in Truro in a snapshot by Davenport West. The Hoppers, newly ensconced in their Truro house, look happy. Edward, who liked this photo, even looks a bit goofy there in his hat. For Josephine Hopper, reworking and transforming existing objects were forms of creativity and a route to further invention. So that in her view, when reworking failed, it was a sign to her that all invention was threatened. Quote, I used to be so inspired over remnants. Alas, not anymore. Invention dying out too, but still can make over, she writes sadly in her diary, November 9th, 1934. Here is a product of Jo's invention and making over. This is before it was framed. Her little circle rug, 27 by 45 inches, made up of 3 concentric layers of colored fabric arranged in a grid pattern and machine sewn onto what was originally a blue linen base, not the gray that you see here. The randomized colors and textures and the shift in number of circles from 12 to 11 create an impression of playfulness within the formal field of the grid. The original colors were bright, green where we now see yellow, and bright red where we now see dull red, probably creating something similar to an op-art effect. Too fragile to be walked on, the piece must have been designed to be placed on a table or draped over a sofa. Some of Jo's fabrics are men's suiting, probably but not necessarily transformed from Edward's clothes, since Jo searched out likely scraps for her work wherever she could. June 1934. I'm going to do all the rugs for the little Truro house. Please don't give Salvation Army any wool jersey of brilliant hue. I do so badly need good red, she wrote to a friend. From this interplay of fine and applied art, one might surmise a career for Jo similar to some other 20th century artists who had male partners. Here is an undated watercolor of Jo's, unfortunately with the title on the bottom and slightly cropped on the top. This is in our collection. You can see it upstairs. This is the kind of work she was doing in the 1920s. Now, an artist couple, as far as I can tell, is subject to the same pressures as all couples, but one might say more so. First, psychology. All artists need a strong ego formation to believe that the products of their imagination and intelligence are worth producing. Second, socioeconomic background and conditions, including the particular conditions of the art world. And third, the character and background of the spouse. I researched 4 possibilities for this paper. Annie Albers, Marguerite Zorak, Lee Krasner, and Helen Frankenthaler. Which one do you want me to do? I don't have time for all 4 of them. Somebody pick one. Frankenthaler? Okay, Frankenthaler is the easiest one. Closer to our day, Helen Frankenthaler and Robert Motherwell, artistic equals, were both well-educated, both from elite backgrounds. Both had worked as artists before, during, and after their marriage. Frankenthaler, who was Motherwell's 3rd wife, he was her first husband, went from a studio that she rented at Day's Lumberyard to the famous Sea Barn that she and he built with Stack Studios on Commercial Street. I think it's 631 Commercial Street, still there. Finally to her own studio near Nelson's riding stables. She wrote to her friend Sonia Rudikoff, September 10, 1967, "I've given up my studio here. I prefer to work, quote, out, unquote, for domestic reasons you can imagine." Bob is using the third top floor as his permanent studio. In other words, she wanted a room of her own. She wanted to be left alone, in spite of having this magnificent personal studio, but it was in the same building as him. In 1972, she said, "For me, being a, quote, lady painter was never an issue. I don't resent being a female painter. I don't exploit it. I paint." This is presumably in reaction to the rising tide of feminism in the late 1960s and 70s, when women were encouraged to think of themselves as women artists, and she is resisting that. But Josephine Nivison Hopper did not have a mingled career as painter and textile designer. After her marriage to Edward, she stopped working regularly. So let's look at the dynamic, destructive for her, productive for him. As Chris McCarthy suggested in her talk here last month, if Jo had not married Edward, likely she might have been a figure in Provincetown art. She did spend time in Provincetown. Perhaps someone like Blanche Lazelle, perhaps like Marguerite Zorak, or to take a male example, like Ross Moffat of Truro. But she did marry him. And I want to make clear in what follows that I'm not making the case for Jo's art being the equal of Edward's. Edward's unique, austere, and alienated take on American society and on human relationships has become inseparable from our cultural recuperation of the first half of 20th century America, and the geometric simplicity of his paintings continues to draw viewers. Edward did some cruel things, but my objective is not to attack him. It is rather to raise some questions. So, some questions. What happened to Jo? What does looking at the intersection of her life with that of Edward Hopper tell us about the processes of creativity? A run through their biographies, their psychology, and their sociological backgrounds, or socioeconomic backgrounds, may help. Edward Hopper was born 1882 into the mercantile middle class in Upper Nyack, New York, his father running a dry goods store, his mother artistically minded. He was brought up in a strict Baptist in a household described by Levin as dominated by women, and he grew to an immense height of 6'5". While Edward dropped religion early, he remained strongly conservative in politics and suffered all his life from what appears to have been a combination of depression and undertreated hypothyroidism. After studying illustration and then painting, 1900 to 06, with Kenneth Hayes Miller and Robert Penride, which is how he pronounced it, both leaders of the APE or Ashcan School of American Realism, Edward had 3 formative stays in Europe, spent mainly in Paris, moved to New York in 1913, and became an illustrator and etcher, which is how he described himself on his marriage license to Josephine Nivison in July 1924. His painting Sailing was included in the famous Armory Show of 1913, but that did not lead to other sales or a gallery. Edward's practice as an illustrator taught him the skill of conveying a dramatic narrative within a few lines. This is copied from Volume 1 of the Catalogue Raisonné, so it's not a very good reproduction. But it's from a magazine called System, which was aimed at businesses. The top illustration is of a story whose narrative is the sales manager had no course but to suggest frankly that his assistant might fit into the vacancy in the other department. Ashcan School work and Edward's early work are forms of genre painting, secular scenes of activity by ordinary people, often portraying what is considered typical of that group for the intended publishers and buyers. The assumptions involved in a predictable typicality can make genre painting anecdotal or sentimental. These are works by John Sloan and Edward Hopper with the same title. Hopper was familiar with Sloan's work. They're scenes of what you might imagine to be typical nightlife of ordinary people in the pre-air-conditioned summer city of New York. In both cases, the point of view is elevated, whether a view from the house opposite an elevated train or a crane shot of a movie camera, as in Hitchcock's take on the same genre, Rear Windows. The Sloan etching is small, 5x7, the Hopper painting is 29x34. Edward makes the implied voyeurism of the scene explicit, showing the buttocks of a woman and a red drape in the interior. Hopper's interiors seen from outside often have a red focus. Red is a high-value color, but also the color of eros and death. blood, really. Edward developed a new genre venue, which was pioneered by Degas, but pioneer venue of the office, and continued an older French one, in addition of what one might call postcoital sadness, here seen in 4 versions. Summer Interior, 2009, which looks like it was done in France, although he says it was done in New York. 11 a.m., hotel room, and A Woman in the Sun. This is covering pretty much his whole career. Edward's disaffected males are clothed and often seen in offices. His melancholy females, nude or in deshabille, tend to have a messed up bed and tossed off heels somewhere in the picture. A Woman in the Sun stands in the life-giving light, that's the lower right there, with her, in the life-giving beam of light that the apparently abandoned cocotte of 1909, upper left, only barely touches with her toe. But the Woman in the Sun holds a cigarette and was described by Hopper to Joe as, quote, a wise tramp. Josephine Nivison was born, look at her life, 1883, into a more bohemian and financially unstable family. Her father, a piano teacher of French descent, not adapted to fatherhood in review. Her mother from an Irish background, who encouraged her independence. Unusually for a girl of modest background at that time, Jo received a BA from the New York Normal College, later Hunter College, studying French, Latin, and theater, and she then studied painting at the same art school as Edward did, where she was a favorite student of Robert Henry, who made a larger-than-life painting of her called The Art Student. Brushes in hand, smock sliding down to her shoulders in a fetching manner, Jo made herself into a modern woman, able to practice a profession and support herself without a husband. Jo spent the 19-teens in and around the art colonies of the Northeast, including Provincetown, performed with the Washington Square Players as an actress, exhibited regularly, and taught school. Her effort to serve as a reconstruction aide at the end of World War I ended when she fell seriously ill with bronchitis and had to be hospitalized in France. When she returned to New York, she had lost her teaching job in her studio and lived precariously, selling illustrations to the left-wing publication The Masses, and moving in the circle of Alfred Kramer and Max Eastman. Also, her parents both died young, in 1916 and 1919. Here is a painting of hers that might have been done around this period. Very strong, beautiful watercolor of tree trunks. This watercolor has been displayed only twice, here at this museum in 2000, at the Hopper House Art Center in Nyack in 2014, remains in a private collection. When Edward and Jo, who had been acquainted with each other at art school and again at Ogunquit, began seeing each other seriously in 1923, she encouraged him to take up watercolor and got 6 works by him included in an exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum that had already accepted 6 works by her. The museum bought a watercolor by Edward from that show for their collection, but didn't buy anything but hers. In 1924, they married, by which time he was already aged 41 and she was aged 40. Thereafter, they lived and worked in the small space of his Spartan but beautifully lit studio apartment on the top floor of 3 Washington Square North, spending almost every hour of every day for the rest of their lives within a few feet of each other. Cynical friends commented, no wonder they had difficulty, that would drive anyone crazy. Later in 1924, Edward had a sellout show of watercolors at the Frank Rain Gallery, and his career took off, while hers foundered. She had no room of her own. Now, I'm going to go into a little bit of sociology here. In 1920s America, the concept of marriage was shifting from the Victorian idea of separate spheres to the modern idea of what was called companionate marriage, in which the wife was seen more as an equal and affectionate communication between spouses was meant to move towards being a new ideal, although sex was still assumed to be something the wife would tolerate in exchange for affection and security. Here is Edward in the late 1920s, Jo in 1936. This is the only painting of her, significantly, however, showing her as an artist. The Hoppers were, in some ways, a companionate modern couple. She was highly educated for a woman of the period, and they conversed readily all their lives about art, literature, drama, and film. Soon after their marriage, Jo began to keep a record of all of Edward's work that left the studio, and she served additionally as his secretary, though she generally drew the line at cooking. I'll be discussing her role as Hopper's muse and model later. In 1930, the Hoppers rented a cottage in South Truro, and in 1934 moved into the Hopper house which Edward had designed, where they then spent about a third of the year almost every summer through 1965. Soon after their marriage, they developed a practice of him driving them to a specific spot where they would make watercolors or paint together. And I have these images thanks to Beth Colleary. So hers is on the left, a view of Gloucester. You see hers is lighter colors, his is darker. Here is, again, this is of circus carriages and railway carriage. His is much more firmly composed. Here you will recognize this one. These are two views of Cornhill, painted at the same time. His watercolors have weight, her watercolors float. This weightlessness was a deliberate effect. Joe admired the same effect in Marie Laurencin. Edward's piece is very close to the painting that he did of the same subject. I couldn't find a high-resolution picture of Joe's lost painting of Dauphiné House in Truro, but you can see it upstairs in one of the panels Henry Lum created about Edward's house portraits for the Hopper Room. The early 1930s seem to have brought relative happiness for Edward in Truro. From 1930 to 38, he produced 64 watercolors and 17 paintings, a level of productivity he never again achieved. It was a less productive time for her. In 1935, her diary reports him saying she should find something to do, so she should keep herself out of mischief. The small Truro house was built with a north light studio for Edward that takes up almost half the house, but there was no workspace for Joe. Occasionally he let her work in his space, but often not. During their marriage, Edward drew numerous caricatures, which he left for Joe to find as commentaries on their marital difficulties. Some of these are now at FAM, so we will be able to see them once they're conserved. This is perhaps the most pleasant one, satirizing what Edward felt to be Joe's upside-down version of what a house should be. Joe painted irregularly through the 30s, 40s, and 50s. This is the painting Truro Hospitality in our collection, produced by Joe in 1957. It's a pleasant but minor occasional painting, a nice passage around the side and the sky, painted to mark the wedding of Horace and Norma Snow, to whom she gave the painting. It's one of the few paintings by Joe to have survived because it never left Truro. By the time Joe's diaries begin in 1933, the Hoppers' relationship had become, perhaps always was, psychologically and physically abusive. Edward repeatedly told Joe her art was worthless and repeatedly smacked, pushed, or dragged Joe, sometimes in front of other people. The diaries refer to bruises, though not in what I have read, to others noticing her bruises or the scratches she sometimes inflicted on him in return. Preventing her from driving at all, or later not letting her drive on her own, were important instruments of spousal control. Joe's anger and pain appear frequently in the diaries. In August 1937, they arrived in Wellfleet to go to a restaurant with Joe driving, but Edward did not want Joe to undertake the difficult maneuver of parking. When she remained at the wheel, quote, he hauled me out by the legs while I clutched the wheel, but he clawed at my bare arms and I all but sprawled on the road. And then he blames me that the audience inside peered out through the windows. On May 10, 1938, while packing to go to Truro, my good slip is torn at the knee, and a new dress all dirty from the floor where he held me down by his knee and got his face well scratched, 2 long scratches down his face, the face that otherwise I am so fond of, and there's a black and blue bruise on my thigh. June 10, 1938. That he is my entire concern is not enough. He wants to be sure he's dominating, having started with the idea that there's no equal, no live and let live, one must be submerged, and I'm elected jackass. I think the trouble with the driving is that he identified himself with every tiny move of the wheel the way he's driving, and when something shows the car moving at my direction, not his, he can't take it. When any slight decision is to be made, he shouts his direction. That can hurt one's mind, always clamping down to prevent its use. Uncanny, all the ways he knows, wearing out, fatiguing, paralyzing the working of the mind. It keeps one always on the alert, the defensive. It would have been a terrible thing for him to have had a child. This defensive second-guessing of the other's mood so as not to be punished is a classic sign of abuse. The extreme sexual dimorphism, difference in size, manifested by Edward and Joe, meant that she was physically completely overwhelmed, though she does report fighting back. This pattern went on for decades, with intermediate periods of reconciliation. In Edward's caricatures, however, he is the victim, or at the very least, a quiet, put-upon fellow trying to concentrate. And the one on the right, he cannot choose but hear, sorry for blurriness, there she is, nagging him while he's just leaning back, and all he wants is a peaceful moment. On the left one, mealtime, she's starving him. He is a skeleton begging for a scrap of food from this woman who was just sitting there reading a book instead. In another one, which I think might have been later, with striped costume, typical of things Joe wore, there's a woman standing on top of a flattened man. Levin associates Edward's abuse with periods when he was unable to work, such as the April 1937 to March 1938 period, just before those passages, when no paintings were begun. But to me, it also appears to have occurred when a success enabled Edward to feel confident in putting Jo in her place. Well, this is an ugly picture, which hardened into mutual disillusion and embitterment after World War II, when Edward's habit of not talking to Jo for long periods, the silence of the father, one might say, drove her to self-destructive behavior in the form of hunger strikes, which did get his attention. There was a period of calm around Jo's only solo show during her lifetime in 1957 at the Greenwich Gallery in New York, and Edward's increasing dependence on Jo as he aged may have made him less critical. But several of Edward's post-war works reflect his disillusion. In this one, Summer in the City, I should say, by the way, I think that this group of three I'm discussing now are among the weaker of Hopper's mature works because the narrative in them overwhelms the light and the geometry. In Summer in the City, a large, ill-proportioned woman sits on the edge of the bed with a look of disgust while her apparently younger and weaker lover hides his head in the pillow on the bed. In the earlier draft, I think he was dead. In Excursion into Philosophy, Plato reread too late, says Jo's record book. The man's frowning, almost cartoonish look of disgust is carried through compositionally by the crease in the open book, coarsely repeating the cleft of the woman's buttocks. Only the man's toes reach the life-giving sunlight. In Four Lane Road, 1951, slightly earlier, as in the caricature He Cannot Choose But Hear, and several other paintings, the man is trying to concentrate while a woman shouts at him or otherwise tries to distract him. Now, looking back at this dysfunction from our perch 70 to 90 years later, it's hard not to fault Jo as well as Edward. For example, why didn't she simply keep painting? Since the funding for the land and the construction of the Hopper House in Truro came from an unexpected inheritance Jo had from an uncle, why didn't she insist on having a studio for herself in it? Why didn't she just divorce the man? Why so much complaining? A partial answer to that one may be that a private diary is where you write down your hurts and frustrations if no one seems to be listening. But nowhere in the transcripts that I've read does Jo consider leaving Edward or divorcing him, nor does she consider getting either or both of them to see a therapist, though she does report anxiously wondering to various GPs whether their fights might be damaging Edward's health. During moments of reconciliation or when he does her a favor, she calls him Dear Eddie, Dear Good Eddie, perfect husband for me. But, and I think it's important, so we keep thinking, why didn't she do this, why didn't she do that? I think it's important in the age of #MeToo that we must be alert, we must remain always alert to placing the agency for the abuse on the victim. Why did she wear that dress? We must also be equally alert to a tendency to blame others for not having had the strength we imagine from a safe distance that we ourselves would have had. In my preparation for this talk, I checked out codependence and attachment syndrome. Codependence is a questionable pop psychology term often used as a critique of the person that does the caring and support because it is said to enable continued destructive or addictive behavior in the other partner. Attachment does come closer. Jo and Edward were a mutually attached and introverted couple, but in a pattern that benefited him more than her. For me, researching this, what is most surprising is not that Jo didn't walk out, but that she kept trying to be creative. Most art wives of her generation or the next one in less abusive situations simply stopped working and devoted themselves to being the muse and or financial support of the great man. But why be interested in these two lives? I want to offer several suggestions, but no complete answer. Artists, in fact, are no better or worse than others. The cruelties of the Hopper marriage are painful to observe, but if we take a hard look at our own families and those of friends, we're likely to see plenty of rotten and painful relationships. In most cases, our interest stops with those who knew those people personally, and what we learn ends at the limits of the circle of friends. The dysfunction of the Hopper marriage is fascinating because it's connected to artistic creation. That interest can become intrusive, even obsessive, because creativity itself is fascinating. Part of the answer of why be interested in these people that I'm going to start with, it doesn't have to do with painting or psychology, but in fact with dramatic structure. The structure of the Hopper's art marriage narrative forms a series of compelling dramatic arcs. First, the epic of Edward, the artist firm in his beliefs and practice, who gains success after a period of trial, and whose work, apparently out of style in his later years, gains even greater renown after his death. Second, the tragedy of a talent, indeed a sensitive person, being destroyed. 3, the melodrama or soap opera or reality television show running for over 40 years of repeated conflicts as the script repeats itself. 4, the grotesque comedy of the Punch and Judy war between the sexes, of crabby, dour old Hopper and his batty, garrulous wife. 5, the ironic tragedy for Jo after death, as the Whitney Museum, chosen by her as a safe repository for Edwards and her artwork, recapitulates at an institutional level Edwards' abuse by disposing of or destroying most of her oeuvre, her oil paintings. Really an astonishing act of curatorial vandalism that makes it impossible for us to ever assess her true accomplishment. Then 6, however, there has been a Gothic revenge narrative as Jo's diaries have come to light and attacked Edward from beyond the grave. 7, there's likely to be other narrative arcs as more unsigned Edward works turn out to be by Jo. This is happening. And Edward's works continue to be looked at through the lens of gender studies and begin to be looked at through white studies. Now I want to turn to a concept from cognitive theory called the curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge operates two ways. Once, in a general sense, once we know something, it cannot be unknown. Once we quote unquote know something, such as the past performance in a business in behavioral economics, which uses this concept, we assume everybody knows it or ought to know it. Or to expand the concept, since we, quote, know the typical behavior our contemporary social constructs attribute to the sexes, we expect to find that phenomenon again and again, and for it to continue. It becomes hard to imagine that others don't share the same knowledge. So individuals, investors, groups, and societies can be cursed by assumptions and stereotypes. The curse of knowledge has proved particularly valuable in psychological studies of false belief reasoning. So 1, now we know something of the inner story of the Hopper's marriage. Many of you already knew it. Once we know biographical material, we cannot ignore what we know. In the era of #MeToo, our knowledge seeps into our reading of the work. Think of Picasso's and Degas' treatment of their models, Picasso's treatment of his lovers, Hitchcock's treatment of his actresses, what Woody Allen seems to have done to his children, what Harvey Weinstein did to his actresses, only to mention some of the more obvious celebrity cases. It is up to each of us to find a balance between what the life tells us and what the work tells us. When we were discussing this talk, Maura Kaufman suggested that one way of dealing with this curse is to say that perhaps the worst parts of a person may come out in his/her human relations, and the best parts may be found in the work. Or one can say, in life, we tend to repeat old patterns, while in the creation of an artistic work, you have to focus like crazy and struggle like crazy, not to be banal or repetitious. So while the result will always be colored by your life patterns, it will fall somewhere away from them, fall somewhere else. Now, contemporaries of the Hoppers, quote unquote, knew quite a bit about great artists and their wives, about women artists, and about wives in general. Here is, this is actually a bit late for this concept, but 1950s professional photograph of Edward and George posed so that she is looking up at the great man. Here are some comments about Edward, the man of genius, amongst many. He discarded dramatic brushwork for a firm, laconic realism. Edward was the strong, silent type familiar to American culture through President Coolidge, the great stone face, on forward through John Wayne and Gary Cooper. The craggy granite surface of Edward Hopper's personality yields slowly to exploration, unquote. Edward's fixity, keeping to roughly the same style from 1920 forward, was seen by his contemporaries as a manly virtue. He embodied, quote, complete artistic integrity, quote, palpably awkward honesty. He moved with a, quote, slow-moving manly body. He had, quote, silence and awkwardness. He had, quote, 1924, a certain masculine authenticity, 1938, a masculine self-sufficiency. Hopper shared this view of the artist who stays one particular course. He wrote in 1935, the nucleus around which the artist's intellect builds his work is himself, and this changes little from birth to death. What he once was, he always is, with slight modifications. There are some other interesting views of Hopper's authenticity from Lloyd Goodrich and others, that Hopper's work, quote, shows sympathy for racial expression. By races are meant subgroups within whiteness of Nordic, German, Norman, French, etc. Hopper himself, writing about his friend Charles Birchfield, found him to be, quote, the latest in our view of painters who have been race conscious, since the artist's, quote, visual reaction to his land needs to be shaped by, quote, the more fundamental heritage of race. And that, again, is European subgroups. There were a few disagreements. Actress Helen Hayes, who commissioned a house portrait by Hopper, his only commission, wrote, I have never met a more misanthropic, grumpy, grouchy individual in my life, and as a performer, I just shriveled under the heat of his disapproval. I was utterly unnerved by this man. This is Edward Newman's portrait of Hopper. To move forward past that. Well, we all, quote, know or used to know what artists get up to with models. While Levin describes a natural development from Edward asking his wife to pose because she was right there, to both of them enjoying her dramatic character creation, the practice, aided by their mutual frugality, why pay a model and have to wait for her to show up, the practice seems to have developed as a natural process. But critical and journalistic discussion about Jo modeling is littered with assumptions that she flatly refused to let the poor man use anyone else because she was fiercely jealous. As a 2012 review of Hopper's Paris retrospective assures us, Madame était jalouse. Other views of Jo were she was a flighty little woman, she was a very nervous woman. She stood there and started prancing around. That was Arnold Newman, who represents her that way in the photograph. The language became harsher in later years as Jo was seen as an irritation, a trial visitors to Edward had to endure in order to get access to him. Now, in interwar America, social advances by women were seen by many cultural commentators and writers as threatening manliness and creating what was known then as a crisis of masculinity. While it was quote-unquote known that the leading realist artist of the first half of the 20th century should naturally be a white middle-class man of Northern European descent, Hopper himself felt that he had to be vigilant to protect his privilege. He experienced his privilege, in other words, as fragile. Apart from his relations with Jo, his denigration of all women artists stands out even for the period. American art itself, in his view, needed to be firmly separated from what he referred to as its mother, which was French art. And in American writing of the period, wives are often seen as weakening or emasculating their men. And I won't go into the analyses here, but you can find this in Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and T.S. Eliot. Quotes on requests during the question period. Now, the polka dot dress. Here's a delightful dress of Jo's that we have in our collection, though we still need the funding to restore it. It was barely worn. It's delightful. It looks like something made for Ginger Rogers to dance in. except that it has stains thrown across the front. Not dripping down, as if one spilled it on oneself, perhaps from tea thrown at her. What dramatic event, one might ask, caused these stains, and why did Jo, who regularly and carefully washed Edward's and her clothes by hand, memorialize that event by leaving the dress unwashed for decades? Well, the biographical imagination can easily run wild with these materials. Isn't this a kind of vulgar interest, a sort of tabloid sensationalism? Isn't it just too horribly comforting to learn that important artists have feet of clay? Maybe Jo just didn't like that dress. Maybe she forgot about it. In biographical studies, aspiring biographers are warned against a phenomenon known as source bias, in which the biographer tends to take the side of the source of her information. If you go through Levin's intimate biography of Hopper, following the adjectives with which she describes Edward, it becomes clear that the amazing resource of Jo's diaries has given her source bias. I believe that she came to loathe Edward and favored Jo. Having been bowled over myself by the information in the diaries, I also am likely to be showing source bias. It is still, however, weird about that dress. So to return to the biography, I think that you degrade the creative work if you try to read the life directly into it. He was feeling X in the work because Y had just happened to him. Biographical insight into creative work will always be severely limited, because only the painter knows what she was thinking when she was executing any given passage in the work, and any conscious thought is often technical. How to get that background to recede, how to deal with three light sources. The painting itself is a material object made up of oils, granulated minerals, and dyes on a piece of cloth inside a wooden frame, but since it depicts scenes, figures, or imagery of enormous resonance, it can be said to have a psychology, indeed an unconscious. However, it does not necessarily, if at all, represent specific events in the artist's life. Instead, it addresses conscious or unconscious questions asked by the artist's mind. While he firmly resisted the genre painting narrativity that he termed anecdote, Hopper was clear that his paintings depicted himself. In other words, they were autobiographical. Quote, "The American scene painters caricatured America I always wanted to do myself," he wrote. Or in 1933, quote, "I've tried to present my sensations in what is the most congenial and impressive form possible to me. The technical obstacles of painting perhaps dictate this form. It derives also from the limitations of personality. For the great painters, their work is, quote, a record of their emotions." Well, what myself or what record of his emotions do his paintings imply? I'm going to take one small slice. As well as being the lead actress or muse, Jo was the set dresser and costumier for the theater of Hopper's art. All female figures in his art after 1924 that have a model were modeled by her, as well as many of the men. Compared to his temporary chroniclers of the urban crowd, Hopper's early mature work already shows only a sparse humanity. Then his models shrink to one, Jo. Jo is Edward's representative other, and every woman starting out in preparatory drawings close to the real woman, then being transformed into provocative, hard, brassy, coarse, but also pensive, abstracted, meditative, expectant females. She is also Edward, modeling for his male surrogates like the pleading youth in Summer Evening. There are no joyous women, no hyacinth girls as in T.S. Eliot, no lovers in the work. These are absent from Hopper's construction of the human. Joy enters his work instead as light, which manifests itself in the material by illuminating a wall and sometimes a figure. Often Edward and Jo wrote a provocative script together to be enacted in the painting. The female character, though interestingly not the male, was often named. Here is Office at Night. In Jo's record book of February 22nd, 1940, she notes, after some color descriptions, man in gray coat, blonde hair, Shirley in blue dress, white collar, flesh stockings, black pumps, and black hair, and plenty of lipstick. Figures stand out in space, not fastened to background. In her diary a couple of weeks earlier, Jo explicitly describes the sexual role-playing of the scenario that the artist and his model are to perform for the artist and the eventual viewer. This is from the diary. It's a business office with an older man at his desk and secretary, female, fishing in a filing cabinet. I'm to pose for the same tonight, in a tight skirt, short, to show legs, Nice that I have good legs and up-and-coming stockings. Underlying this role-playing narrative is, of course, also a deeper level of tension, the narrative of the troubled marriage. Explaining Office at Night in 1948, Hopper cautioned against narrative determinism. After discussing the three sources of light in the painting and evidently well aware that he had composed a narrative of sexual tension between provocative woman and unmoved male, he finished by saying, quote, "Any more than this, the picture will have to tell, but I hope it will not tell any obvious anecdote, for none is intended." So we have to deal with the push and pull here of the Hoppers themselves composing anecdotes, but the analysis of the work stepping away from them. Now, as noted by art historian Carol Troyan and others, there is a Hopper woman. She is coarse-featured, big-breasted, small-waisted, sexually experienced, one would say a fantasy of the ever-available satisfying woman, except that her contemptuous hardness promises rejection or emasculation should the man approach her. In the language of the day, these avatars are floozies, dames, or tramps. This Hopper woman lacks an inner life, which is, of course, the key to portraiture. Now, in this rather blurry selection of close-ups of this kind of figure, I've included the quote-unquote nice girl upper right here from Hopper's Summer Evening to show the hardness, even within the middle-class figure. The very busty woman in South Carolina Morning, a memory painting, is Edwards' only representation of a person of color that I've been able to find in his work, even in a subservient position. Hopper undertook long car journeys in his troubled searches for external subject matter that could stimulate the next painting directly or in an amalgam. He seemed genuinely troubled by the need to find an external source. His figures, however, are internal, imaginary, types or avatars of his feelings and fears materialized through the body of Joe as the closest other, who he then re-internalizes and transforms into these types. Put another way, his imaginary engulfs its nearest other and puts it back out on canvas as a theater of types. Here's how Girly Show started. There was a very useful 1960 perception by critic James Flexner. The sensuality of the women in the paintings of Hopper would have been a danger to him, but by making his female alter ego his starting point, he remained on his own terrain, with a path of retreat stretching behind him to his personal fortress, his place of repression. There's also a Hopper man whom you've been seeing in several of the paintings I've shown. This is a late painting, Sunlight in the Cafeteria, 1958, a detail. He's recognizable in this late example, pale skin, blonde or light brown hair, gaunt, enervated. He often gazes at the floor or into space. No woman meets his gaze. But some Hopper women do seem to have an inner life. Amongst others, I won't be discussing, the expectant woman of Cape Cod Morning, possibly the usherette in New York Movie, borderline case of the women in Morning in the City and a woman in the Sun. But in this one, Morning Sun, a woman who in the final version still looks very much like Joe, though younger, is sitting on a bed bathed in light. The composition recapitulates the spatial and light structure of Excursion into Philosophy, but with a very different result. Edward tried numerous studies with Joe nude and with Joe lightly clothed, and he took particular care in his painting to get the light and shadows correct. And of course, Edward, in addition to this perhaps homage, controlled his narrative by ending his career with two comedians, which depicts Joe as his creative partner, as the two of them bow out after the tragicomic performance of their lives. Now, I'm just about at the end of my time in my talk, but I want to end not with two comedians, but with the 1951 painting, Rooms by the Sea, which I consider one of Hopper's finest paintings, a painting I greatly admire. The uninhabited house or room starts occurring in Hopper's work in the early 1930s. Early Sunday morning, he painted out, that's that strip of shops, red shops. He painted out the figure of a man in the fourth window from the left. In Rider House and the other Truro house portraits, it is the house that is the persona, standing alone in the landscape, but not lonely. The removal of figures, of characters, pushes the work towards the geometric and leaves it more open for the viewer to insert him or herself into the space of the street or landscape or room. As Hopper aged, the small bedrooms or cluttered restaurants of the early work empty out, more light is shown coming in from the outside, and the compositions become simpler. In his brilliant 1981 essay on Room in Hopper, the poet John Hollander wrote of angels or messengers of sunlight appearing as ever stronger geometric lightfall, creating a meditative space of the kind Edward lets Joe occupy in Morning Sun. Light, as Hollander argues, is an ancient metaphor for thought coming to the thinker from outside, as when, near the beginning of Book 8 of the Aeneid, Aeneas' thoughts are racing, quick as flickering light thrown off by water in bronze bowls, reflects the sun or radiant moon, now flickering near and far, now rising to strike the ceiling's gilded fretwork. Well, this painting is one of three paintings of empty rooms towards the end of Hopper's career. In style, it's flat and dry. Hopper said, "I use as little oil as possible." It's got it simplifies the structure of the Hopper studio. This is Philip Coach's photograph. You see, Hopper has turned the opening of the door around, and we can see from looking into the next room of Coach that the room that's there to the left is not a living room, but in fact the bedroom. I think I won't deal with it in too much of a detail, but the sofa is a strong red, much more high-value color in reality. If you see it at the Yale University Gallery of Art, which I would strongly recommend, much more high-value color than in book representations. Hopper knew, and we now know, that what you would see from the painting's vantage point was the marital bed. Hopper, working in the classical style from a general sketch to one or many drawings, to the ébauche or, let's get a further one here. The ébauche or laying in of the design on the geometric ground of the canvas. In this close-up, you may just be able to see Hopper's charcoal lines. They're visible between the side of the building and the sky and sea. So I think there's a tension in this work, which is very powerful, between almost a painting by numbers deadness caused by the lack of movement between the filled-in sections, and on the other hand, the strongly determined movement of the eye along geometric lines, the variety of color tonalities, from the bright off-white of the patch of sun to the recessive purple shadows. Even you can just make it out. There's some pink even on the white wall from the sun. It's unusual for Hopper in that it represents his intimate domestic space. He thought of calling it Jumping Off Point. Then it was got rid of as too suicidal, and it remained Rooms by the Sea. Rooms by the Sea was painted by a man who ground down his wife, and the time around its composition was one of dreary struggles for the couple. Joe feeling bitterly that it is congenitally impossible for him to recognize the existence or needs of anyone but himself. But the painting attempts, in my view, a resolution of the space of the domestic interior and the outside in the face of the final jumping off point of death. I'm ending with a slight swerve here. Edward Hopper might have met literary critic and writer Edwin Wilson, who was married to Mary McCarthy during a lot of the time he was around Truro. Hopper was a friend of John Dos Passos and Katie Smith, who were friends of Edwin Wilson. In 1941, Wilson published The Ruin and the Bow, a psychoanalytically inflected study of 7 texts, culminating with the drama Philoctetes by Socrates. I won't summarize it, but a lot of the point of the play, which you can, by the way, read in a beautiful translation by Seamus Heaney. His conclusion is that Philoctetes has a suppurating wound that causes his leg to stink. No one can bear to be around him. But he also is the possessor of a magic bow that hits whatever he aims it at. Wilson concludes, superior strength may be inseparable from disability. The victim of a malodorous disease is also the master of a superhuman art which everybody has to respect and which the normal man finds he needs. In other words, Wilson is saying, the stink of the wound in some way forms part of the particular power of this particular bow. And it may, indeed, in the case of Robert, shape the bow. So that's it. Thank you.